we'll move straight into our next one. I'm going to welcome Max Liu back to the stage. He's going to moderate the next panel called AI Policy and Global Change. So it'll be a nice expansion to the big picture here. I'll welcome up Felipe Neves, who is Latin America lead for Google Workspace and Gemini for Education. As Joba just mentioned, Victor Lee is Associate Professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Education and Faculty Lead for the AI in Education Initiative at the Stanford Accelerator for Learning. So Victor, welcome up. And our third panelist is Taylor Reynolds, Technology Policy Director of the MIT Internet Policy Research Initiative. Go ahead and take it.
Does all the microphone works?
I think so.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Hey, everyone. Good to see everyone again. It's such a privilege to be able to moderate this panel today with three really distinguished speakers. And I want to begin by saying, I think for a topic like AI policy for global change, it's so important to have people from both research, policy, and the corporations. And I think we have all of them here represented. So I think this will be a very, very exciting conversation. And I do want to begin by sharing a quick story I learned in the past 2 days. So at a conference like this, you run into people from all over the world. And one of the friends I made is from Latvia, right? A small country in Europe with 2 million people. And Linda was telling me how in a country like Latvia, the LLM, the latest AI technology, don't often reach to them at first, or even when they reach to them, they don't often perform at the best level that they would perform in an English-speaking country. I think for scholars like me who study and live in the United States, we often sometimes take it for granted that the most advanced AI technology is just readily available for us. So with that as an opening, I do want to get each of your thoughts from your perspective. Help us to understand, is that the case globally that the AI development is unequal? What are you seeing, and what should we be aware of? I want to start with that, and then we get into the policy part of things. Victor, you want to kick us?
I'll offer one thing. So just to contextualize my sitting here is that I have a strand of international work, including work with Germany and in the EU, and also in the expert committee for Teach AI and OECD's new draft AI literacy framework that will be finalized within the next several months. I just want to point to an analogy because I think that the question is there's an English centricity in terms of how a lot of the AI technologies work, especially with LLMs. And so, it's sensible given a lot of the corpora that are used in which countries have had the, proverbial microphone to generate the text for which a lot of this is done. And I do maintain a concern, like for anyone who does coding, until we had block-based paradigms, and you still had to learn to code using English words. And that is sort of a homogenization that we should be aware of as we approach this, because there's these very subtle biases that we don't necessarily think about in terms of how different words have meanings, even going left to right in written script. And so, I think that there's a range of implications in this. What I have seen is a lot of people overseas just use it in English, and that's it's an interesting double standard. In the United States, we don't have that expectation for multilingual fluency in the same way that other countries do, and it's challenging. So the question is, how do we empower the development of linguistically responsive, community-specific AI technologies, and is there the appetite to decenter the U.S., North America dominance?
Yeah, no, and echoing on that, so for context as well, I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil, and I lead our software for Latin America. And I think also the challenge is the access to the technology, right? So on top of the cultural and I think the context challenge of training the LLM and everything else, I think just the access to doing your first prompt everything starts in English, right? So people fear they're missing out just because it is in English. And then we have the layer of context and bias and everything else based on language. But also, it's important to note that in emerging countries such as Brazil, we do have bigger challenges, such as infrastructure, right? So we are still having schools with basic, energy infrastructure, getting internet speed for the first time, and then Chromebooks, for example, and then we have AI, right? So there are layers that we need to solve first so we can get ready to start using cutting edge technology such as AI. So I think that the challenge is bigger, especially for emerging countries that have like other problems on top of it. But I see the cultural challenges as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I had similar kind of first reaction is that in kind of the way that we use artificial intelligence here, we use AI is very different than in other places in the world. And connectivity and electricity remain a huge problem for a large part of the developing world. So not only is it that they don't have access to the latest models because they're not geographically available, it's that they are using a feature phone or they're using a low-level smartphone that doesn't have the capacity to do this. So I think that one of the big themes that I would put across for today's panel from my perspective is, can we be building models that can run on on small phones, on like not the fanciest phones, so that they can be used by people?
I think that's really interesting, and I do think companies are building small models that can run on those like smaller devices. And then the question is, what amount of compromise are you willing to take? Because the performance wouldn't be as good as large models. Are like if the less developed country with less internet infrastructure are using less advanced models, help us understand how big of a gap would that be? Like, what's the real implications in terms of what they can imagine, what they can do with the smaller models? Is the smaller model ever going to be on par, with the latest model, which I doubt?
Well, I think it depends on the use case, right? So if you're talking about like a light usage as well, I think the light model can work just as good, right? Because the use case do not require a powerful model, for example. So when we talk about schools, K-12 education, I think we should be good on that end. But when we translate that into like developing applications and other softwares based on AI, then we can have this kind of situation. But I think that for K-12 education, as long as you have internet and basic infrastructure and low end, for example, cell phones, I think we can have access to what we need. But then when we're talking about developing applications, then we can, I think I can see that challenge. Yeah.
A few things that I'd point to, and I've had this conversation because internationally it's definitely an issue. It's an issue in the United States as well. We saw during the pandemic a recognition that not everybody has internet at home. Many people use one phone shared within the house, or have spotty connectivity and lack of devices. And so, I think for all sake, but especially in regions that don't have easy access to infrastructure that is present, we need to think about these small or local models in there. Will we get there? What's the compromise? So keep in mind that every time there's a news release about some amazing new benchmark that an LLM has met, it's like, and it's passed the super MCAT at this level. That's not most of the use in there. That's sensationalized, Like, we oftentimes don't use the technologies at the full power that they're at for most uses, and there can be ways to support those specialized cases in there. What I am seeing, though, is that there is still likely to be some additional hardware upgrades to really match the architecture. Does it mean that everybody needs to jump to the latest version of technologies? No, but we do need to make a concerted effort, because there are some things that are going to be very difficult or very slow, to the point that we wouldn't find that acceptable. So I do think there will be some investment to be made. made there.
So if I can tell you just a quick little story. I have a group of researchers here at MIT this summer who are working with me to answer the question of what advice would you give to a developing country to position themselves for an AI future.
What are the advices?
So what we did is we went around and we talked with experts across the institute. So we would go and we'd talk to people and say, what do you think? Is this possible? And you cannot tell a developing country, yes, you've got to be investing in massive data centers, and like it doesn't make sense with these scarce resources. So the question is, how do you position yourself? We've done this in, we've looked at the factors of production, kind of an economic perspective. What are the factors of production for AI? And we've said, which are the areas that you can do well in? Compute, not a good one. Not a good one for developing countries. Electricity, also not a good one. Data, that's actually an area where there's potential. And what about areas such as entrepreneurship? Like that's one of the core things that we've seen in developing countries is that they have solutions that they need to find themselves, and they're finding in very innovative ways. So like, what are the positions? One of the groups that we spoke to focused on the difference between large language models and using an approach called mixture of experts, where you're actually developing smaller models that come together to solve bigger problems. And I think the paradigm of building their own large language models that answer all the questions isn't going to work in developing countries. They're essentially going to have to buy that capacity from elsewhere, the same way they do with cloud computing now in many instances. On the other hand, developing very specific local models to solve specific problems seems like something that's absolutely possible. So how do we position AI education in a way to kind of give them the best shot at solving local models and keeping them small there, and then tapping into the large language models when they need to?
It's really interesting. Both, I think, what Victor said about the need for investment to take care of this less developing countries, but also the need for local entrepreneurs to really develop contextualized solution for the local market. I guess my question is, let's come to policy. When it comes to investments, investing in building this, models that works for smaller languages, smaller regions, are companies like Google sufficiently motivated to do it from a commercial standpoint, or this is where policy has to come in and say, we want you guys to do it? And do like smaller country have the leverages over big corporation who often holds the latest models to say, hey, we want you to build localized models? So I guess that's a question for Felipe.
It's a very good question, but I think the answer, it depends, right? So even in emerging markets, we have like cutting edge technology in big centers like São Paulo, for example, like Mexico City. So when you talk about emerging countries, you have this disparity within the country, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is infrastructure in some parts of the countries, and there are lack of infrastructure in some parts of the countries as well. So I think it's a combination, and I think we, at least for now, we have to wait and see the appetite for both ends to see what can be done. But I think it can be possible, right? Because the problem of, for example, Brazil, is that you have this massive country with a lot of disparities within the country. So when you talk about a public policy for the country, that's kind of challenging, right? Because then you have to adapt to both ends. So I think that depends, but I think it can be done, yeah.
Thank you. And Victor, a question for you on AI literacy. Even with me and my friends and be over there, sometimes we argue we have different definition of AI literacy. It could be, knowing how to distinguish, critically consume information from AI to you have to know how to vibe code things. What do we mean by AI literacy? And at a global scale, what should we try to achieve?
It's an excellent, and I would say, to be frank, still unanswered question by the field. I think everybody, AI literacy definitions are like toothbrushes. Everybody has one. Nobody wants to share in there. You can reuse that for many, many things. I gave a keynote a couple weeks ago in Hong Kong, and one of the other speakers shared a slide with me while we were sitting in the wings, and I was very struck by it, and it stood with me. It was about attitudes across different nations about AI. And I think that's really important. I think for that, it was anxiety and optimism were the dimensions. And you can see there's quite a spread. And the reason why I mention that is because those differences that appear geopolitically or geonationally is telling in terms of where we would allocate our concerns with AI literacy. So privacy, for instance, has different kinds of status, whether it's like encoded into formal laws, whether it's sort of seen as important but not super important, whether it's not even seen as a concern. And that's one of those things that we would say, oh, the security and privacy of your data as a concern. There are, countries where, outsiders might say that regime is very rigid about how knowledge is presented and what's considered truth. And so, evaluating information quality, that's another set of issues. And so, there's a richness and complexity across different human cultures, even within the same national boundaries. And this is where I just am always a skeptic that there's going to ever be a one-size-fits-all AI or approach for it. What we do have consensus on is this technology has evoked a response and uncertainty that seems pretty robust across places. And so there's a hunger to wrap one's head around it and to be responsible with it. But responsibility is going to have different meanings across places. So like the ethics, which I would say tends to be a part of AI literacy, is not the same for all settings.
So how do you approach this if you're trying to build something like Craft? You're trying to make it available to people around the world. Do you have to modularize everything so people do their own shopping carts?
I think that being very transparent, that's why Craft has a very intentional co-design model to focus in the US and sampling across geographies and subject areas to be responsive to those and to say, take and adapt. We're not going to presume to know the answer, but we can give things that might be ideas or something you modify for your purposes. We're in conversations with other countries that are looking at doing something similar, and what we are going to promote is establish partnership and co-design systems locally to foster that. And I think that's going to be the paradigm for how we want to think about socially responsive and useful software development in the future.
Taylor, were you going to say something?
Just one quick comment. So I grew up, my mother was a teacher her whole career. And one of my favorite sayings is she would say, you don't go to school to learn something. You go to school to learn how to learn. And I actually think in this kind of AI era, it is changing so quickly that if I were trying to design a curriculum, like imagine the curriculum we were designing 2-3 years ago, like it's like completely different. So how can we position students and adults to be able to pick up these skills as we're evolving here? Because I just think it's quite hard.
Then the harder question is, how do you develop future-proof policies, right? That policy doesn't evolve nearly as fast as curriculum. A curriculum is already falling behind technologies. So when we think about policies that empowers the next generation to be AI ready,
what I would caution with this, and so for myself, like if you remember very beginning of 2023, they said, English or, human language is the new hot coding language. Prompt engineering is going to be the job of the future. And I just think that we need to be very cautious when we make any firm declarations and policies that have a whiff of for now in there and think long term. Like what's the practice or what are the larger dispositions that underlie that as time goes on, they may choose to do prompt engineering in a classroom to sort of exemplify it, but we still tie back to and point back to what are those core ideas. It's been an interesting moment, like computational thinking. There's a question of, do we learn to code now? And very active discussions. Hal Abelson said that they're bickering about it in their faculty meetings. And it's, I think, given resurgence to the ideas evoked by computational thinking to think about the ways that you solve problems using outside agents like computers. and not being bound to, in this programming language, knowing APIs, knowing this or knowing that, because that is going to change. But we do still want to think about how teachers can situate it for the moment so we can still get those relevant connections, but still make sure our aim is on that thing that's going to continue with a much longer lifespan.
And just to add on that, we have here a few representatives from states from Brazil here, 7 states here, they're all there. And I mean, the challenge also in Latin America is that for you to deploy this public policy that you approve by like passing a bill, for example, it can take up to a year. And once you do that, everything changes again. So you're trying to, adapt, but at the same time, if you want to do a public policy and pass a bill and then deploy this, strategy that you try to anticipate, we are in time that everything is changing so fast. So that's an extra layer of complexity, which is timing. So I think I'm curious about what's going to happen, right? Because now it's one thing, one framework, and then 6 months from now, everything can change, and then you have to rearrange everything. So just to add color on this challenge that we may have, yeah.
Sorry, can I just add one little thing? So I am fully in Hal Abelson's camp on the computational thinking. I think he's done a wonderful job at kind of pushing this as an idea. I do think from an education, from a policy standpoint, there are some things that seem like they're going to continue over time. And I wrote them down. I got, number one was computational thinking, like teaching people how to think about how computers can work with them. Second, I put math as something that has been important for a long time. I also, here at MIT, we talk a lot about quote-unquote bilinguals. And a bilingual to us is not about languages. Bilingual is that you have some skill, you have computer science along with some other skill. So if you are a biologist, you have biology plus computer science. If you're an economist, you have economics plus computer science. So it's about teaching computer science as part of the curriculum for these other areas. And I think creating bilinguals is important. And finally, as we've seen with other technologies that come in developing countries, is entrepreneurship. So focusing on entrepreneurship, how can we take the things that are evolving and turn them into products, solutions, services that are useful in our own country?
Let's dive into entrepreneurship, innovation, and this very exciting topic. So OpenAI released ChatGPT agent yesterday, and I'm sure many of you have heard the news. Essentially, it gives ChatGPT the permission to navigate your browser and do things for you on your computer. What struck me was that on their press release, they spent maybe a quarter of the paragraph explaining or cautioning the user there might be risk involved. We don't know how, the potential thing you're trying to do might inadvertently harm your computer, so be careful. This is very new to us. So my question on entrepreneurship and innovation is, how do we balance safety versus innovation, privacy versus utility? And how are you guys advising governments when they think about policies on this?
Well, I'm going to focus on the educational side, right? Because I think that it's a broader conversation than what we do there at Google for Education. But one thing that I saw on the first day of this event was Halls talking about this app inventor applications from girls from India trying to solve, water distribution and everything else. And I think one thing that is very valuable that we are increasingly seeing in Brazil and Mexico and other countries, El Salvador, for example, it is doing these hackathons while in school. And yes, you can have this direct benefit to the society if you want, but if you don't, that's fine as well. But the goal for me is once you do that multiple times and once they graduate high school and they go to college, then they kind of know what to do if they want to build something, start a startup, build a new solution. So I think a good thing would be to foster this kind of initiatives, challenging students to build things, even though it's not a company, but, build solutions. And I think we can all benefit from it in the future once they graduate and enter college and, the professional life.
So how do you guys do it specifically? You guys work with schools to organize hackathons and... giving them
Yes,
credits.
exactly. So we work with the state secretaries of education, and then we work in two levels, right? We work directly with the state secretary because they do have solutions that they need for their day-to-day business, for example. Not business, but day-to-day things they have to do. So how do you increase productivity? How do you handle bureaucracy using AI, right? And then we help them to do hackathons within the state. So launch a challenge with students and help them, So we have been, over the past 6 months, we have been traveling all over Brazil and Mexico doing what we call Gemini experiences. And the cool thing about it is first we focus on explaining what is AI, right? Because as Victor said, it's not magic, right? It's like a mathematical model, for example. So then we give them like a basic prompt engineering class. And then the most important part is the challenge. Then we challenge them to start using basic like tools such as Gemini or ChatGPT, whatever, to build something that can help them. And then we try to top down that to students so they can do the same. So it's very basic, but if you don't do the basic things and you want a country to build solutions and build new companies, you're never going to get there. So if we start with education, with these challenges, hackathons, I think is the way forward.
Thank you.
What I would add, first I want to put in the disclaimer in large neon lights. I am not a policy expert. And I mean, there are schools of public policy. Like, it's a very hard, very complex field, and I think it's preposterous for me to claim I have the right policy.
But you do advise a lot of them from a subject matter
I
expert.
advise people who are making policy, but I don't issue the policies in there. Yeah. And I also have my biases. I think that there's real power in thoughtful scholarship and critique and research. And so I think that, we oftentimes jump on what feels trendy, and we don't ground it empirically or ground it in like reasoned thought and argument about risks and harms. And so, it's only now that some of the things that were talked about a decade ago are like, oh, wow, that's actually really further marginalizing some groups. And that's been said for a while. We could have had that conversation at a broader scale sooner. Where we are, we're trying to balance that innovation, entrepreneurship, and regulation is, again, not a policy person. I do think we do need some current lines in the sand regulatory positions, and we also need to understand the mechanisms by which these move. So Hal gave an example, I think, during one of his Q&A sessions about cell phone bans. It's like, in the United States, it's just like spreading across states. Just now they're almost competing, like who can get the cell phone ban out first. And I think that's an important policy dimension. Like, what do different countries do? And they sort of take model from others in there. And so understanding those dynamics and how those things work, I think is an important factor to consider, but also incentivizing. And I think that's where government has, found some leverage, is putting in incentives for responsible, responsive, low environmental impact AI, and providing those incentive structures to encourage that. But otherwise, I'm not a fan of increased paperwork.
These are really good inputs. I'm actually going to, if I can just focus on two quick policy suggestions that we've been talking about in our group. The first is this idea in policy circles called a regulatory sandbox. I don't know if any of you, if you've heard of that. Essentially what it says is, before we make any rules, because we don't know how this, as Felipe said, we don't know where this is evolving, it's going so fast. Before we make rules, we're going to create this regulatory sandbox that allows you to build products, to experiment, and then we're going to evaluate after, and maybe we'll have to pull some things back, put in some rules, but we allow you that room to investigate.
How do you do the sandbox? Do you have real users to A/B testing, or do you?
So this would be government policymakers say, we're going to, it's like regulatory forbearance. We are not going to put rules on this for the first 2 years, and you're going to be able to do things with this, and then we're going to evaluate after 2 years. And was there harm? Was there damage? Do we need to put in rules? The second thing is, this is going to sound so crazy, but something as simple as bankruptcy laws. And you're thinking, what in the world do bankruptcy laws have to do with entrepreneurship and with AI? Well, it turns out that the bankruptcy laws have a huge impact on whether or not you're going to have entrepreneurs in your country or not. So I was living in Europe before coming here to MIT, and I had a friend in a European country who left a very good paying professional job to do a startup. And the company allowed him like 2 years to go do this startup. He does it, and it's computer related, and it fails. But in this particular country, if you fail at your startup, you are essentially out. It's like bankruptcy personal. For 7 years, there's nothing else you can do. It's hard to find a job. It's super high stakes to go start a company. Now, compare that with Silicon Valley, where someone goes out, tries a startup, and it fails. And they say, well, I have another idea. That one failed. I have another idea, and I'll tell you, I learned a lot from that last failure. Like, I will do things differently this time. That's actually seen as kind of a positive in some ways. Whereas, so like having these policies in place that make it easier on entrepreneurs to try out new ventures, that get incubated via the Gemini experiences that kick these things out. You have to give them a playground, some way to work on these things and build them with low risk and then deal with it after.
Does that mean
2 minutes you spoke, 17 Silicon Valley ventures just failed.
Does that mean to some extent we have to put the priority on privacy slightly, pull it behind a little bit so that we can, encourage more open innovation, more risk taking? Not in the political correct way to say like, oh, we don't care about privacy, but no, like in some way we have to recognize that in the AI era where the model are trained on your data, we have to discuss again what's the scope of privacy and what are the things that we have to be prepared to sacrifice for the convenience of the technology. Should there be a discussion about what privacy means?
Yes. It's hard. I mean, this is a complex moral question. This could be debated for a very long time. So regulatory sandbox and willing people may help us to debug, but I can't pretend that I know the answer. I do think that it is compromised when we think about privacy and security. Like some of the things as they're structured kind of come at the expense of another. We could try to be imaginative, but it's just inherently a sticky problem that has dogged people for decades in other forms, centuries in other forms. So I think it will continue to be a wrestling match.
If I can just jump in one thing. So this kind of ties into another branch of our research that's not AI related, but it is privacy enhancing technologies. So there's a whole slew of new technologies out there that are kind of breaking this in some ways the trade-off between privacy and usability. We have things like differential privacy. You've got things like federated learning. You've got other tools like multi-party computation that we build. Jeff Schiller up here in the back corner builds those kind of tools to do multi-party computation where you can actually run functions over encrypted data. So there are solutions. Are those going to be right away available in developing countries? Probably not, but they're coming.
Right. When we look at on the ground what's happening in developing countries, I think a lot of times we find local companies or global companies like Google are more embedded than a lot of times than researchers like ourselves. So I'm curious. Also, when you advise policies, there's one to advise policy at a national level, or Teach AI does a lot of policy advising work at OECD level. But then, Felipe, you were also saying working with local schools. That's a very on-the-ground approach, going to the 60 different places. Help us to understand the necessity and complexity on this two bottom-up and top-down approach in driving global change. Which one are you seeing more momentum, and which one, help us to understand, to appreciate the work you guys are doing on these two fronts?
Yeah, so I think it's happening both at the same time, and that's kind of the challenge, right? Because first, we need to be there within the classroom trying to understand the use case of AI. Because, over the past 2 days, we all heard that AI is not going to be used in everything, right? We need to first understand, okay, this is helpful, this is not actually helpful. Once we understand the pedagogical value of AI, then you can go up to the legislator or to the political leaders and then try, I mean, to, not we, but the states and themselves do the policy that they need to implement good practice. So, but the challenge that I see is finding those best practices, right? Because we're in a momentum that everybody's just saying AI here and AI there, but we need to work with the professor, with the student, to really understand the value of this solution or this tool. Or, I mean, it's a very broad tool. Like if you talk about Gen AI, you can do a lot of things, but what is the use case? Or what are the use cases that you need to make a teacher life better with less time, student life better with more personalized learning? I think we are in a momentum of figuring out the use cases, and once we have the use cases, then I think we can scale to the, you know, to the leaders to do policy, or they can understand what to do, right? But I think we are in this momentum, and the thing that we did across Brazil and across, you know, a lot of countries in Latin America is like, as you said, like giving them playing field to try things, you know, even with not like, even if they're not going to use next day, but at least experimenting things and understanding how that can help them or not. That's kind of where we are. We're still figuring it out because many of the things that we have, not only at Google, is only available in English. So we're still waiting for that to be translated, and not translated just word by word, as you said, like the context of Latin America and the countries as well.
Victor, when you work with communities to co-design their own AI literacy approach or, you know, their AI approach, other than the fact that what you're saying, like different communities seems to have different focus, right? How are you seeing, like globally across different community, how are we collectively approaching the next AI ready generation? Are you seeing commonality in how people sort of coming from different ways to think about AI, or you're still like at this point seeing just more divergence in how people think about this?
I think it's a function of the hype right now, but pretty much every country I have spoken, there's this sense that this is such a massive opportunity for their respective country, especially economically and for their workforce. And so I think that's been a big lure for everyone, and so they're very eager to engage with it and to go with whatever information has been out first.
Are you seeing good examples where countries or communities were able to successfully use AI to improve the learning outcome or productivity of their community?
There's been no quality research yet that has been showing that at sufficient scale. I mean, that's something, it's moved so fast that the research isn't even there yet. So anecdotally, there are, you know, some cases, but anecdotally, there are also the counter cases to it. So I just want to be honest that the empirical backing isn't there. I mean, like, I want to ask a provocative question just for rhetorical purposes, but, you know, does ed tech help students succeed? Ponder that. But we put all the money into it.
That's a very good point, yeah.
If I can add, kind of follow up on Victor's comment there. Before I came to MIT, I worked at the OECD, and there was another wave of kind of technology that came through, which was computing. And so at the OECD, in the official statistics, they used to say, you can see computers and computing everywhere except in the productivity statistics. Like, that's the one area where you can't find them. But it turns out, the good news is they showed up 10 years later. So we saw all of a sudden this boost. The investments in computing that took place in the early 1990s showed up in productivity statistics in the 2000s. So I think that it's going to take us a long time to kind of figure out where the productivity, how these things are working. And that's not super helpful for designing ed tech right now.
No, and my email inbox would disagree with the increase in productivity.
But then for our educators here, for our students here, the question is, you know, they're thinking about what should I study? what course should I be taking at university? And for teachers to be thinking, what should I be teaching my 6th grader, 10th graders? Let's talk about what should students be learning at different stages? How early should they start thinking about and learning about AI? And yeah, curious. You guys can pick any age group and just want to hear your thoughts. And I figure we probably don't have a consensus on this either, like many other things.
So can I, I was jumping on this. So I think in some ways they know more, the young students know more than we do, and they're using this stuff. And I was in another panel a couple months back, and we were talking with companies on cybersecurity. And one of the things that we said is, you as a company have to figure out how you're going to allow, or what you're going to allow on using like large language models within your company. And you have to figure it out now and make it available, because your employees are already using it. Like, they're ahead of you, they're using this stuff whether you want them to or not. So you might as well get a Gemini deployment where it doesn't use the data that's put in for training, for example. So I would say it's kind of the same thing in education. I look at the students in my own family who are already using these things. So, and sometimes they're, I think, a little bit ahead of their older teachers who are struggling with how to do this. So I think it's imperative that we figure this out.
I would contend early, elementary school for formal instruction, which is going to emphasize like safety and responsibility and personal rights and choices in there. And also, AI, just everyone wants to anthropomorphize it, and I think making sure that one's stance towards it. But I would go even earlier still. However, what that means is it's oftentimes at the home, and you're likely using AI at home. You might have an Amazon Echo device and talk to Alexa. You might say over dinner, oh, I got this AI-generated search result in there. And I think those conversations, the parents need to be very mindful about how they're modeling AI use, and then what messages they're communicating to their kids implicitly and explicitly, because they're gonna always play that game of imitate mom and dad. See, I'm doing a similar sort of a thing. And so I think this is gonna be a whole spectrum approach, but of course, all the supports for learning look different, and so we're going to need to use different levers for that to like help parents to be comfortable with doing that, get more children's books out there that kind of help model this, etc.
Related to that is, it seems like children in this growing generation is perceiving AI differently than how we perceive, right? They start to perceive all screen to be touchable. They start to perceive AI assistants as like a personified friend, like a lot of Professor Ying Xu's work was showing us. What insights do you guys have on those things? How kids or students are interacting with AI, like in real life?
Well, in multiple ways, right? It's hard to describe like the top trendy ways to interact with AI. But one thing that I'd like to add is that if you do not do that at the school level, at a public school level, I think you're going to increase the gap of inequality, because you have private school students having that by themselves because they have technology, internet, devices, and then you go to the public school level for low-income communities. If they don't have that at school, similar to like understanding and learning how to operate a computer, for example, like 10 years ago, you're going to increase this divide that once they go to the job market, it's going to be like the first time using AI, or I can see 10 years from now. So I think that it is important, not only for like their own benefit, but for like closing the gap of inequality in terms of the use of technology.
When you guys thinking about working with schools on whether it's hackathon or kind of curriculums, what goes into those? Like, how do you think about, oh, these are the things we want to teach, these are the tools we want to show the kids, maybe these are the tools that we won't show it to them yet? How do you think through those kind of challenges?
Well, that is a decision that the school will make, right?
It's on the school. So
yeah,
you
it's on the school.
provide
It's not
all the
on us.
options to
Yes,
the schools.
we give the tools for them, and they will decide whether or how they will use AI for the school. Yeah.
Interesting. And in those cases, I would ask you, do you find the schools ready and fluent in talking about those things, to be thoughtful around this? And Victor, for your case, since so much, what you're advocating is earlier education, sometimes at home, are parents ready, or that's where also like a lot of investments needed to get them ready to talk about these things?
When it comes to children, parents are never ready.
But is AI ready to educate parents and children in this case?
No, I mean, I think we're only now starting to get the buzz that AI literacy is important. Right now, the spotlight is in formal schooling, but this is all ages and all tasks and activities. So, I mean, I think the message is not there yet.
And it sounds like it never will be, like you said, parents will never be fully ready to educate their children. So it's almost like every tech and
Well, that's me being
evolution,
tongue-in-cheek as a parent, but
right? Like parents were never ready to talk about social media with their kids.
no, but I mean, like, there's things and interesting leverage. Again, I think this comes to policy and larger public campaigns, but you know, there's been pushes on child rearing practices that have gained momentum and mainstreamed, whether to, you know, breastfeed or to use formula, discipline and such, screen time, and appropriate sorts of conduct in there. So I think there's ways to do it, but it just needs to become recognized as something that we need to really all mobilize for, and then bring in the insights and wisdom from people who've been on the ground doing that work for a long time to figure out strategies.
Anything to add here? All right. I'll move on to the last part of my question. Then I would ask you to think about your questions and then line up on the two sides. Then later we're going to get to your questions. When it comes to education, as we all know, it's so highly contextualized. Each market is different. But when it comes to language model, they are in many ways very homogeneous, right? They are trained on like the entire database. They tend to show inclination, like, you know, the research has shown that AI models are not always value neutral. How should educators and policymakers be aware of this? How concerned should they be, or is this not a really concern?
There's an AI literacy answer to this where, you know, if everyone understands sort of the data that have been used and what has been available, and, you know, that in general, these things kind of regress to the mean in there. But I think a lot of that can also be done with like the attitude with which we talk about AI. It's like, yeah, it's, you know, vanilla text to start with. But what we care about is, you know, your style, what you want to accomplish or say. And that means, I think, shifts in education for what we celebrate and recognize and update. So it might be that we're really interested in you completing this entire project. AI can be part of it, but you're going to have a lot of things to do in addition to that, and celebrating that as the target, as opposed to, please turn in this 3-page paper that Eric did not do the night before for your history class, because that's everything. That's history. It's like, that's not how we want to go. So I think it's going to be a shift to that, and then also understanding what kind of a tool is this, and what can it and can it not do, and what do we value that humans do and embark on with the range of tools, practices, and communities they have available.
I think for the value part, like, it's very easy for us to say we probably value mastery approach than performance-based approach in terms of, you know, goal for education. But that has been hard to achieve for all the practical reasons. Do you think AI will have to drive a necessary change to a more mastery approach where, you know, performance is no longer?
I don't think AI is going to be the driver on that in there.
But cheating becomes so easy, right?
Yeah, I mean, but again, what's cheating, and when do we define it as cheating? And, you know, I think we heard from our very intelligent first panel, you know, it's nuanced and complicated, and you know, like I'll draw this example. According to, you know, studies, Walter Ong of orality and literacy, when oral cultures, when writing was not mainstreamed, and remember, this is only like in the recent centuries that writing became a standardized thing, that letter literacy was like everything. Intelligence was celebrated at verbatim recitation. So as close as you could stay to someone else's material was good. Now we have written, and now it's like, no, what can you do different? You have all these other things and you can go different, or you can potentially remix that. And I think it's just to be mindful that this is affecting sort of a larger cultural change in there and what we look at and value or see. But our education system, the tensions and challenges that make education, I think, frustrating but incredibly fascinating, those have been around for a long time. And those have complex levers to use, and AI is not the winch or whatever, or the crowbar that solves it all. It's just another part of it.
I really like that example of the oral traditions and being verbatim, and things are really changing there. Yeah, this is difficult to navigate. Like I'm just like there's no real easy answers on this, and I don't have much more on that. Yeah.
Well, for a company like Google, you guys are making your technology available, both pushing the frontiers of AI and in the meantime reaching the end market to make it available. And especially for you, like in the developing country, in a non-English speaking market, how are you finding people? Are people asking questions about the value that AI has in it and the value of local value, where they see in conflict or in concordance with each other?
Yeah, so I'd like to answer that with a use case that we did with our friends here from the University of São Paulo Med School, right? So one thing to look at AI is not only like replacing things, right? Like I'm gonna replace this, or instead of doing that myself, I'm gonna do that with AI. It's like, how can you add value to things that you need because you don't have the resources, for example. So for the Med School of São Paulo, they have I think one of the most competitive residency exams in Latin America. It's the best med school in Latin America. And they were having a hard time creating mock exams for their own students because it's very time consuming. Like one question takes around 2 to 3 hours from a medical practitioner to be done. And they were just not doing it like the mock exams, right? So then we partnered with them to use Notebook LM to try to create this mock exam without spending millions of dollars. That's the cost to do like a very large and very good mock exam with more than 100 questions. And we did it. And then we created this framework that now they can run like 10, 8, multiple mock exams for their students without spending millions of dollars. Actually, they can use the free version of Gemini to do it, right? And then when we trace this parallel with states, for example, they have to prepare students to take the Brazilian SAT, for example, that is called ENEM, right? The National High School Examination. And the way to look at this is like now with AI, you can add new opportunities, new experience for students to practice, for example, right? So I think that's a very good use case, a use case that it was done by them, of course. But I think that if we start thinking about, okay, I don't want to change things, but I want to add value and add new, use case and opportunities. What can we do to at least save money and save time? And that was a very good use case.
But I think for use case like that, it's again emphasizing on the need for localized knowledge. It has to be people who has been dealing with the problem coming to you.
Exactly.
Oh, there's a problem with spending so much money, and then we need AI to supercharge it.
Exactly. And then that comes to my point before, right? We need that. We need that, like that questioning and that ask for help or ask for support to start building use cases, right?
Wonderful, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, please line up over here and then tell us who you are really quickly. What's your name, who you are, where you're from, and then what's your question? Please go ahead, sir.
I am William Mejia from El Salvador, the Bitcoin country. During COVID, the government decided to deliver a laptop per child in the public school, and also to improving internet connectivity in the public school. I would like you to give me an advice how, as a country, we can take advantage of this huge investment when we don't have enough skillful teacher to take advantage of this technological condition. I don't have money to pay you, but I will appreciate your advice.
So, just a quick one on that. So, one of the big, when we talk with developing countries about how to do this, focusing on infrastructure, it's like a base that you have to have. So, electricity, connectivity, devices like this are very important. Then, I think the training of teachers, training of students, that opens up a whole world of potential online education if you've got connectivity, developing courses. But like, I think laying that foundation is actually the right way to go, and then building the skills on top of that. Maybe they've got other.
I concur with that. I think the infrastructure is going to be the primary. You can't put the cart before the horse on this. But I would say look online and make sure that you are within the country or the government having thoughtful people who are informed on good, free, or low-cost resources to get started of good quality.
Yeah. So my question is.
What's your name and where from?
Oh, I'm from Penn State University. Yeah, I work in the statistics department.
Thank you.
So my question is, traditionally, students have to remember a lot of facts, right, of different disciplines. But now with AI, like ChatGPT, you can even just talk to it. So a lot of things are like at our fingertips, or you just talk directly to your cell phone and you get them. So it seems quite unnecessary to remember those facts. But I think intuitively, I think we all know that if students know too little, down the way, it's going to be a problem. So the question is, how much do we still need to teach them? I know this would depend heavily on the discipline, but I think maybe a more precise and relevant question is, how should schools even approach this? Let's say we don't know how much we should teach them, but how do we even find out? What would you recommend as approaches for schools to find this out?
So I think one undertone, correct me if I'm mistaken, is that there's some sense that if memory were a muscle, it's not going to be used very much anymore. So what do we do? And then our fear is that it degrades and dies. However, it finds some other thing to exert itself on. So like there's a zillion things that young people are remembering now. Like my kids can name all the TikTok and YouTube influencers. They mean nothing to me, but wouldn't remember something else. And I think a lot of it is because whatever activities or practices they're in generate new things to know and remember. So the question there is ultimately, what do we value? But I don't think that as our brains and bodies evolved, that the brain lets capacities deteriorate. What we focus it on, I think, is a more complex question of curriculum and pedagogy. And I think a lot of the people in this room are thinking about contexts that involve complex problem solving and marshaling of resources and norms that tend to get diluted in our current education system, which is very much like, what's this, define the standard deviation. And it's like, that's fine to a degree, but, we've started to over-engineer a system or overfit the system to those metrics. And so, shifting those and recognizing, and I think this is also especially hard, there may be some things we need to say goodbye to as required content because it's just not as useful for mass scale or not successful. Still should be available. But I think that's a curriculum issue. Does that answer some of your question?
Somewhat. Yeah, I know it's a difficult question. I just want to get a sense how you feel about how, like, say, at the university or high school, teachers would even take some approaches, like some methods to maybe figure out how much should still be hardcore required, and what can be relaxed?
I mean, I would say for the high schools, especially ideally, what is the goal of the discipline that you're teaching, and what are the ways in which knowledge or work is done, and center that, and then, organize the things as maybe required towards that. I think there's movement in some policy circles to further formalize that. Like science has been pushing that more with NGSS, but it's a slow moving mechanism. So even if it is, high school teacher teaching biology, is the most important thing to be able to name every single tendon? I mean, in certain like medical practices or other, but there's other work that this knowledge is, the reason why we require it is what we try to help students accomplish and do. So calibrate towards that.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, they have to be the last one? All right, please go ahead.
Hello, my name's Rohan. I'm a high schooler from New Jersey. I was just wondering, I had a question based on the resources of AI. So I was wondering, because there's lots of AIs being developed, and they're always getting better and better. Things like the newer ones such as DeepSeek and NotebookLM, and then there's also products that a lot of people make that take up a lot of resources. So I was just wondering, on a global scale, if we wanted to make those tools more accessible, how exactly would that work, if that would be possible, given the limited resources?
Yeah, there's lots of new things. I think one of the interesting things about DeepSeek and these kind of smaller models is they can be run, you can download them, Olama, you can download these things and run them on machines. And I think the goal with some of these is to be able to actually run them on a mobile phone. So training them is another story, but putting them into use, running them is different. So yeah, I think the training is going to be hard. It's probably going to be developed countries that are doing a lot of that, unless it's small scale models. But then applications can be done at a local level.
Okay. And I was also just wondering about the climate issue, since a lot of model development uses a lot of resources. So would that halt any large scale revolution, or would it be okay? Is there a resource limit, basically?
It's a problem.
All the billionaires investing in LLM also investing in nuclear fusion. Not that they're getting closer, but they're doing that. That's what they're hoping for.
Fusion was, demonstrated at Lawrence Livermore recently, but again, for those to actually scale to an economic way is going to take some time. Right. So, I think part of it is incumbent on everyone in this room to be mindful and help communicate and articulate the message and be thoughtful users and judicious users for these reasons, if that is very much in line with your values. But I think that's something that we all need to do to build that collective will to say, yeah, this is using a lot of energy, so maybe we shouldn't just jump to AI for everything.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone. I think we had a honest conversation on a very difficult topic, where there's so many things that are still uncertain. A lot of things honestly in the hands of students and teachers and users themselves. I think there's a lot more discussion to be happen, and I want to thank all the panelists for sharing the stage with us. Thank you.